Dr. Sergio Penna. His research involves looking at human genetic diversity throughout the world, and he is one of many experts who claim that race is not a scientific truth.
So here's our race denier, and we see at the outset an effort to make him appear credible as a man of science. Race deniers cloak ideological arguments in scientific terms. Race denial is an ideology, not a science, and the race deniers themselves make this clear. They believe, or want you to believe, that denialist arguments will help defeat racism, xenophobia, and ethnic hatred.
Dr. Penna wants to replace the old idea of race with a new way of thinking about humankind. What he proposes is a model that is not only scientifically sound, but one that coincidentally undermines racism, xenophobia, and ethnic hate.
So here you see how the deniers smuggle in their ideology by calling it coincidental. But it's not coincidental that they mentioned it. They mentioned it quite deliberately to make race denial seem emotionally appealing. In spite of the fact that denying race is not a common sense or a logical thing to do, it can nevertheless be made appealing to people emotionally. And some of the deniers who are shameless about demagoguing and manipulating people's emotions will go so far as to imply or state that acknowledging the existence of races leads to a Holocaust. And they'll even put images of Hitler and concentration camp victims and state that the antidote to this is to deny that races exist.
There used to be models of thinking of ways of dividing humanity, and the first was this, what we call the typological approach, that sees races as very fixed entities, that they are homogeneous inside and very different, very distant from each other. This model really led to disaster, led to the Nazism, this National Socialism, and the Holocaust.
Of course, the Nazis persecuted mainly the Jews. And are Jews a race, a religion, a culture, a class? There are a lot of ways in which Jewish people can be identified. And there is a longer history of people being persecuted on the basis of their religion than on the basis of their race. There is a long history of women being persecuted. It continues in many parts of the world today. Is the antidote to that the denial of differences between men and women?
This is a bankrupt model and was replaced soon after the Second World War by a model based on populations. And even though the model based on populations was very noble and the intentions were very good, very soon population simply became sort of a synonym for race.
This is a very interesting admission.
If you divide the world into continental populations, which would be more or less roughly equivalent to what people used to call races.
This is a very interesting admission. The term population is very broad and very vague. Populations can be inhabitants of towns, nations, or whole continents, or particular religious, linguistic, or racial categories within any delineated geographic area. There are no genes for religions or languages or cities or states. There are genetic markers that correspond with race. The effort to replace the term race with the term population was at root an effort to obliterate concepts and to make it difficult or impossible to communicate concepts. Race refers simply to sets of characteristics or phenotypic traits that are heritable.
We know now that mankind arose very recently, once, and in Africa, and from there populated the rest of the world. So you cannot think of Europeans and Africans as two different groups of people, because Europeans are derived from Africans.
It is grossly inaccurate to suggest that the ancestral roots of modern-day Europeans are the same exact roots as those of modern-day Africans. In fact, the DNA evidence tells us that that is not the case. Modern-day Europeans and Asians have Neanderthal DNA within their genomes. Neanderthals were regarded as a separate species or subspecies. So at the very least, we have a clear line of demarcation for two distinct races on this planet. If you want to call Africans the pure Homo sapiens sapiens and everybody else a hybrid race, that is one way of expressing it. But the fact is, we are not all Africans, not entirely.
Scientists have found that most of us still have a little bit of a Neanderthal inside us. A study into the DNA of the human subspecies found that they interbred with modern humans tens of thousands of years ago, and their genetic mark remains today. The BBC's Palab Ghosh has more on these extraordinary findings.
This is a skull of a modern human, and this is from a Neanderthal. Look closely and you can see that this one has a slightly longer brain case. Most scientists believe that these are two separate species, and there wasn't much interaction between the two. But now we know there was interbreeding, and that all non-Africans living today are part Neanderthal. The researchers extracted DNA from Neanderthal fossils and compared it with that taken from people living today. They found that the DNA of Europeans and Asians is 2% Neanderthal.
It's a very exciting discovery because it gives us really the first strong evidence that there was interbreeding with people like the Neanderthals. And it means that modern humans in different parts of the world may have slightly different mixes.
The races do not exist.
There is new evidence that humans inherited up to 4% of our DNA from Neanderthals. The study in the journal Science is based on painstaking research into 3 Neanderthal bone fragments. Scientists reconstructed the Neanderthal genetic code and compared it to modern humans from across the globe and found there was up to a 4% match with humans everywhere but from Africa. The theory is that our human ancestors migrating out of Africa some 70,000 years ago had some amorous encounters with Neanderthals somewhere in the Middle East.
We mean that they interbred or they had sex.
This is the first real evidence Neanderthals and humans had kids, which means, despite the old assumption that Neanderthals disappeared from the evolutionary chart,
Neanderthals aren't quite extinct. They all live on a little bit in many of us.
Do not exist.
So the genes that came from Neanderthals, we don't yet know what their significance might be. They were distinct from us, but they were actually quite advanced humans. They could walk upright as well as we can. Their brains were as large as ours. They were pretty good at what they did in terms of stone tool making. They buried their dead, so they had some very human features. But it looks like they were a somewhat separate line. And what this research also shows is that there are at least 70 genes that have been picked up that seem to be unique to the modern human line.
Do not exist.
Tens of thousands of years ago, our species lived alongside a different type of human, Neanderthal man. Now, scientists have discovered that we also shared the planet with another distinct human creature, the Denisovans. We know this from DNA analysis of this piece of bone and tooth. They were found in these caves in southern Siberia. It's a discovery that's astounded the experts.
If the team publishing this have got it right, it's nothing short of sensational, because what they've discovered is a completely new lineage of DNA that is not Neanderthal, that is not modern human, that was probably widespread in Asia, and actually links in to one particular group of living humans.
And all non-Africans have some Neanderthal DNA. It's these startling findings, published in the journal Nature, that are changing our view of human evolution.
Do not exist. 99.9% of our genome is identical. And that the variation that we have is shared among all populations on Earth.
Okay, so now we're back to using the term population as a stand-in for race. What race deniers do is constantly switch back and forth from outright denial of race to using euphemistic substitutes for it while assuming its definition. And then they'll trot out these statistics and use them in very misleading ways. For example, the idea that we're all 99% identical genetically is meant to imply that there is just a tiny sliver of variation among us that couldn't possibly be meaningful. But of course this is fallacious, because the amount of genetic variation overall cannot explain the amount of variation that is expressed phenotypically. If it could, then blacks and whites would have skin shades that were 99.9% similar. If it could, then chimpanzees could be presumed to be able to speak English 98% as well as human beings can.
We share more than 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees.
The brain is one of the things that's changed the most during human evolution, both in terms of its complexity and its size. And so when we look to find the parts of our genome that make us human, we're particularly interested in finding out whether these are things that are involved in the brain.
They had a whole array of material charting the differences between humans and chimps. Importantly, many of those differences were not in the actual genes. They were in switches.
It turns out that the vast majority are not genes. Instead, they're pieces of our DNA that we can think of as switches. They're pieces of DNA that turn a nearby gene on or off, that tell it where, in what cells in our body, in what tissue, at what time, or at what level to be operating.
And there was something even more intriguing about those switches.
A large number of them, more than half, were nearby a gene that was involved in the brain.
In Pollard's work, one particular piece of DNA stood out. It was a piece of DNA that is known to be active in the development of one of the key parts of the human brain in the embryo, the cortex. When she looked at that DNA in chimps and compared it to the same DNA in a chicken, it was different in just 2 letters. But in humans, it was different by 18 letters. A massive mutation.
This was about as great of a eureka moment as you could have as a scientist.
So here is another intriguing piece of evidence suggesting how DNA can shape our distinctive human qualities. We now know that DNA works in many different ways. Through genes that make the stuff of our bodies, through switches that turn those genes on and off, and through sequences of DNA's chemicals that throw those switches. Taken together, what this all adds up to is a way that we can at last understand how small differences in DNA can generate enormous change.
Basically, you can make massive changes just changing those switches. So a small change, a couple of DNA letters, could have a profound effect.
And so that final Darwinian puzzle, how a human can be so closely related to an ape and yet be so different, is now slowly being answered.
The foregoing isn't meant to imply that the human races are as different from one another as the human species is from chimpanzees, but Germans and Nigerians are more distinct from one another than are Germans and Swedes. This observation precedes any assessment of any intelligence differences. It could be that the Irish and the Vietnamese, for example, have the same overall average intelligence, but that does not negate the fact that they are 2 separate races. The sets of heritable characteristics that are unique to the Irish and to the Vietnamese respectively would be sufficient to classify them as races. The existence of races is ostensibly undeniable and manifestly consistent with evolutionary theory. The negation of race is a negation of concepts, and the motivation behind such a negation can only be ideological. Race denial is an ideology that should be opposed by anyone who values truth and its pursuit scientifically.